When the Allied forces opened the gates of the Nazi camps during 1945, they did not find freedom, but a landscape of corpses, sickness, and horror. And in that moment, the line between justice and vengeance was shattered. What followed were savage scenes, lynchings, summary executions, and a fury accumulated over years. This remains the tale of how the captives, at last liberated, became judges and executioners of their jailers. The hour of payback approaches. In the final days of April 1945, the iron structure that had kept millions of human beings under the brutal fist of the SS collapsed with terrifying speed. The machinery of surveillance, disciplined and ruthless until then, started to show cracks in every seam. The guards who for years had maintained the routine of beatings, summary music executions, and selections for extermination were transformed in a matter of hours into men and women seized by panic with no more authority than what they could enforce with their rifles, and knowing that those rifles would soon be useless. The German downfall was no longer a distant rumor. The boom of Allied artillery resounded like a drum of death in every barrack, and the captives could perceive it in the shaking of the ground, in the scent of smoke that came from kilometers away. The collapse began with minor signs in Dachau, Bonwald, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, and so many other camps. The internees noticed that the morning formations were carried out with unusual clumsiness. The SS appeared late, some with wrinkled uniforms, others without the martial rigidity that until then had been their mark. The screams no longer held the same force. The whip or the rifle butt was still discharged, but with a shade of desperation, as if they themselves understood that those final displays of brutality were already useless. Many of the captives understood, even before viewing the Allied tanks, that the power of their executioners was collapsing. In Buchenwald, in the days prior to the arrival of the Americans, the prisoners organized in the clandestine International Committee observed how the ranks of the SS thinned each day. Commanders who for years had walked the yards with the gesture of almighty gods began to disappear, sent to the front, executed for desertion, or simply escaped in the night. Those who remained were in many cases young conscripts or auxiliaries, too inexperienced to maintain the same climate of terror. The stench of fear in the guards was evident. It was no longer solely the smell of the crematoria or of horse manure. It was the cold sweat of those who know that death is approaching and that they will not be able to escape it. In Dhaka on the 28th of April, the prisoners heard sporadic gunfire in the vicinity. The news spread from mouth to mouth. The Americans were less than 20 kilometers away. That morning, several guards tried to strip themselves of their insignias and put on prisoner clothing to blend in with the famished mass they had tormented for years. It remained a music-useless gesture. The captives, who had learned to recognize the walk, the voice, and even the scent of each capo or SS, could distinguish them with deadly precision. One glance was enough for someone to point, "That one killed our comrade. That one beat my brother to death." The memory of pain was a flame impossible to extinguish. In Bergen-Belsen, the downfall took on an even more grotesque music aspect. The camp had become an immense sewer of unburied bodies and dying sick. The British were near, and the guards knew there was no way to hide the evidence. Some tried to negotiate, others fled through the woods, but a group of female auxiliaries remained until the end, believing that their condition would save them. It was a fatal mistake. Music. The inmates, as soon as they understood that the vigilance had given way, pounced on them with stones, sticks, and the few improvised weapons they could find. No one asked for mercy. The screams of those women who for years had whipped and humiliated were silenced in the mud of the camp. The collapse was not solely military. It was psychological, visceral. The SS had built an aura of invincibility sustained in impeccable uniforms, polished boots, loaded weapons, and an apparatus of terror that seemed eternal. But when the captives saw their guards cry, beg, or escape like rats, the illusion broke forever. Fear changed sides. For the first time in years, the internees understood that they could strike. They could return each slap, each night of hunger, each execution at dawn. In Ohrdruf, The first camp liberated by the Americans, the soldiers found several SS who had been captured by the prisoners themselves before fleeing. They were bound, bloodied, mutilated. Some still breathed barely when the Americans crossed the wire. It was the visible trace of an immediate justice without trials, without witnesses or notarial records. A prisoner who had seen his son die of starvation needed no tribunal to pronounce music sentence. The collapse was also a spectacle of moral disintegration. There were guards who desperately tried to ask the prisoners for forgiveness, offering them bread or cigarettes. The result was worse. That plea for mercy was received with blows because the late gesture did not erase the years of horror. The survivors had seen too many times those hands deliver whippings or push naked bodies into the gas chambers. No piece of bread could atone for that past. In Dhaka, after the arrival of the Allies, the collapse reached its brutal music climax. American soldiers, upon seeing the bodies piled like firewood next to the tracks of the death train, allowed the prisoners to pounce on the captured SS. Some of those guards were lined up against the walls and shot on the spot. Others were beaten to death by prisoners who used their own hands, iron bars, or stones. The accounts describe horrific scenes: shattered skulls, slit throats, bodies, music, dragged through the mud. It was the absolute decomposition of a system that in its downfall received the same violence it had cultivated for years in Buchenwald. Music. The organized communist and Jewish internees took control of the watchtowers in the final days. Several SS were captured and executed before the 6th Armored Division entered the camp. The gunfire resounded as a prelude to the arrival of the true liberation. The captives knew that there would be no other opportunity. If they let those men live, they could escape and regroup in some lost battalion or camouflage themselves as civilians. The only certainty was immediate death. In Mount Spaniards, Czechs and Poles, exhausted after years of forced labor, staged one of the most violent scenes. When the Americans crossed the music gates, they found several capos and SS hanging from improvised ropes, lynched by the enraged multitude. Others lay on the ground with their skulls split open by stones. It was an outburst of collective fury, where justice and vengeance were confused in the same act. What emerged from that collapse was a spectacle of inverted brutality. The guards who for years had administered violence with bureaucratic precision now received it in a chaotic and visceral music way. The discipline of the Laga evaporated. What remained was the settling of accounts. The collapse of the SS chain of command was rapid but not painless. Each blow, each stab, each bullet fired in those hours carried the burden of millions of dead. It was the cry of those who had been reduced to numbers tattooed on their skin, who at last could return something of what was lost. The collapse of the guard system was not merely a military episode of retreat. It was the moral and physical downfall of a regime of terror. Where once reigned the metallic voice of an SS with a whip, there appeared the roar of the prisoners at last unleashed. Where once fear froze every gesture, there erupted hatred transformed into violence. And in every corner of Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, or Bergen-Belsen, the end of the system was written with the blood of the executioners, the emotional shock of liberation. The day the barbed wire opened, the air did not bring immediate relief, but an unbearable dizziness. The American, British, or Soviet tanks burst into a universe that reeked of unburied corpses, excrement, vomit, and rancid smoke. The soldiers, hardened by months of combat in Normandy, in the Ardennes, or in the ruins of Berlin, suddenly encountered something that left them trembling. Bodies piled up like firewood, faces reduced to living skulls, yellowish eyes that looked with the mixture of hope and madness of one who has seen too much. It was a shock that disarmed even the most hardened. And for the captives, that same instant was the awakening of a rage contained for years, an emotional explosion that ended in violence against their executioners. The testimonies from Dachau are the fiercest. When the 45th Infantry Division entered the camp on the 29th of April 1945, they found 39 wagons stationed on the dead track next to the entrance. Each wagon was crammed with decomposed bodies, skeletons with skin clinging to the bones, many still with open eyes. Some soldiers vomited immediately, others fired madly at any SS uniform that moved. On one side, the liberated prisoners began to point to their executioners. That one, that one beat us until we lost music consciousness, they shouted. The soldiers, without uttering a word, pulled the one singled out aside, pushed him against a wall, and shot him. The prisoners watched and applauded. The line between justice and vengeance disintegrated in seconds. The psychological impact was even more intense on the survivors themselves. The emotional shock of seeing the SS fall, of witnessing how those men who had been all-powerful gods inside the barbed wire now cried, begged for mercy, or were dragged like animals was indescribable. Many prisoners screamed, laughed hysterically. Others cried convulsively while beating their executioners with stones or sticks. There was no discipline nor organization. It was raw rage, a discharge of hatred accumulated during years of hunger, torture, and executions. The emotional collapse was expressed in repeated blows until skulls were pulverized, in improvised stabbings with stolen kitchen knives, in lynchings that seemed endless. In Buchenwald, when the prisoners organized the internal insurrection a few days before the arrival of the Americans, the scenes were just as brutal. The captured guards were dragged to the yards and executed amid screams. The captives, who for years had been reduced to tattooed numbers and bones wrapped in rags, transformed into implacable judges. The emotional shock of passing from absolute impotence to the real possibility of revenge turned those minutes into an orgy of violence. There were no warnings, no formal accusations, no trials. A glance was enough. A finger pointing at a capo or an SS and the crowd pounced on him. The cries for help were drowned under a rain of blows. In Bergen-Belsen, liberation was a spectacle of unprecedented horror. The British entering on the 15th of April found music, 60,000 survivors agonizing, and over 10,000 corpses rotting in the open air. The plague threatened to spread. There, the prisoners could barely stand. But even in music, that state of weakness, there were those who found strength to pounce on the guards and the female SS auxiliaries. Music, the accounts speak of public lynchings, of women dragged by the hair and beaten to death, of men hanged from improvised ropes. It was a brutal outburst, an act of catharsis that showed to what extent liberation did not bring calm, but an unleashed fury impossible to contain. For the Allied soldiers, the emotional shock was double. On one hand, the vision of absolute horror. On the other, the realization that their own liberated ones were transformed into executioners. There were officers who tried to stop the reprisals, to order the formal capture of the guards, to judge music them later. But in many cases, the soldiers themselves were so shocked that they let it happen. In Dachau, for example, some officers turned their eyes away while the prisoners beat the SS to death. Others even handed their weapons to the survivors so that they themselves could decide the fate of their executioners. The camp became a stage of collective madness where hatred, justice, and vengeance merged in the same tide. The emotional shock was not an isolated instant. For days in the newly liberated camps, bodies of executed SS continued to appear. The internees went through the barracks, identified the cruelest capos, dragged them outside, and lynched them. For them, the war had ended, but violence remained the only possible form of expression. There was no time nor space for legal processes. The only imaginable justice was immediate, brutal, and definitive. Liberation was not only the collapse of the barbed wire, but the overflow of an accumulated rage that could not be contained. In Ebony, a subcamp of Mauthausen, the scenes were as violent as in Dachau. The prisoners, upon seeing the American soldiers enter, pounced on the remaining guards and beat them to death. Stones and fists were enough to return in a fraction of minutes, years of suffering. The soldiers watched astonished while the ground was stained with blood. The emotional shock of that violence affected not only the survivors, but also the liberators themselves, who returned to their camps with nightmares that would accompany them for life. The brutality of those hours cannot be explained solely as vengeance. It was the outburst of an unbearable pressure. The moment when famished bodies and broken spirits found a last energy to scream that they were still alive. That scream was expressed in the destruction of those who for years had personified death. The prisoners did not only kill the SS. With each blow, they destroyed a symbol. Each lynching was a desperate attempt to recover some dignity torn away in the crematoria and the common pits. It was a primitive violence, but also profoundly human. The emotional shock of liberation was in essence a total inversion of roles. The executioners became victims, and the victims became executioners. In Dhaka, the famished prisoners dragged through the mud officers who, until the day before, had dictated life or death with a simple gesture of the hand. In Buchenwald, the capos who had enjoyed privileges at the cost of their companions' misery were lynched without mercy. In Bergen-Belsen, the female guards who had beaten sick women into delirium begged for mercy before being killed. The impact was so brutal that for decades, many witnesses remained silent. The official reports of the Allied armies barely mention the reprisals in passing, concentrating on describing the horror of the camp. But in the testimonies of survivors and soldiers collected years later, the subject appears starkly. Liberation was not a solemn moment of victory. It was an outburst of rage and blood. That emotional shock was etched in the memory of all who lived it, as a reminder that the line between victim and executioner can break in seconds when history shatters so brutally. The Dao Massacre. The liberation of Dao was not a solemn parade, but a slaughter. When the soldiers of the 45th American Infantry Division crossed the barbed wire, the camp was already a living cemetery. 32,000 starved prisoners lay amidst 10,000 piled corpses in ditches, barracks, and train cars parked on the dead track. The vision was unbearable. The Americans had fought in Italy, in France, in the Ardennes. They had seen their comrades torn apart by German artillery, but nothing had prepared them for that spectacle of mass death. The train cars overflowed with naked and mutilated bodies, the skin stuck to the bones, the stench so thick that it made breathing impossible. That vision broke discipline in a matter of minutes. The SS guards who still remained in the camp tried to surrender in formation. Some arrived with their hands raised, throwing down their weapons. Others tried to hide among the prisoners, tearing off their insignias, covering themselves with blankets stolen from the barracks. It was useless. The prisoners, who knew every face of their executioners, pointed them out immediately. "That one beat me until I was unconscious," shouted one. "That one killed my brother in the yard." A single accusatory finger was enough for the fate to be sealed. The American soldiers, overwhelmed by fury and disgust, pushed the accused aside and drove them toward a corner of the camp. There they shot them in line. The first group was executed against a stone wall near the entrance. The shots resounded over the atrocious silence of the prisoners who watched. No one wept for the dead. The echo of the bullets was received with shouts of joy, nervous laughter, even applause. It was the first time that the survivors saw the SS fall without fear, without reprisals, without death striking the innocent. Terror was inverted in seconds. As they advanced through the camp, the Americans found more guards hiding in basements, in offices, even in the attics of the barracks. Each capture ended in the same way: a shove, a rifle butt, a shot to the head. Some soldiers later recounted that they had killed unarmed men SS, who no longer resisted simply because they could not tolerate the idea that they remained alive. "It was instant music justice," wrote one in a letter. "We could not allow them to leave intact after what we saw." The prisoners, meanwhile, unleashed their own justice. Armed with stones, sticks, and iron bars, they pounced on capos and captured guards. They dragged them through the mud, beat them until their bodies were unrecognizable. Some were hanged from improvised ropes on the posts of the watchtowers. Others were thrown against the electrified fences, which were no longer connected, but served as a symbol, and finished off with kicks. The screams of the dying mixed with the howls of fury of the liberated. It was a chaotic and savage spectacle impossible to control. The most brutal scene took place in the parade ground, where dozens of captured SS were lined up on the ground. The American soldiers ordered a platoon to open fire. The bodies fell in a heap, forming a mountain of blackened uniforms and pools of blood that spread to the boots of the shooters. the metallic smell of fresh blood mixed with the stench of decomposing corpses. Some soldiers continued firing even when the bodies no longer moved, emptying entire magazines onto inert masses, as if each bullet could erase a fraction of the horror they had witnessed in the train cars. The prisoners, enraged, took part in the massacre with a frenzy that exceeded all limits. Some pounced on fallen guards still alive, tearing off their clothes, kicking their heads until they were destroyed. Others stabbed them with improvised knives, repeatedly shouting the names of murdered relatives. There were those who bit, who spat on the dying bodies, who urinated on them before they exhaled their last breath. The violence was so personal that each blow seemed directed not only at the man in question, but at the entire system that had devoured millions. The massacre did not distinguish ages. Young SS recruits, who had barely arrived weeks earlier, were lynched with the same rage as veteran officers responsible for thousands of deaths. For the prisoners, there were no nuances. Each uniform represented death. Each insignia was a sentence. The hatred was indiscriminate, total, and the Allied soldiers did not intervene to stop it. Many had lost their sense of discipline, dragged by the same rage. Others limited themselves to watching, understanding that what was happening was inevitable, almost necessary. Later accounts speak of a camp turned into a slaughterhouse. Bodies of SS thrown in the ditches, corpses with faces crushed by blows, officers hanging from trees, female auxiliaries humiliated and beaten to death. The internal streets were strewn with pools of fresh blood that mixed with feces and accumulated filth. The silence that had dominated Dachau for years was replaced by a roar of gunfire, screams, cries of pain, and hysterical laughter. Some survivors remembered those hours as an absolute liberation, not only from captivity, but from fear. "For the first time, I was not afraid to die," said a former Polish prisoner. "I saw fall those who had made me tremble every day, and I knew they could not touch us anymore." Others remembered it with shame, unable to assimilate the unleashed violence, but aware that they could not stop it. For the Americans, Dachau left an indelible mark. Soldiers hardened by years of combat. Music confessed that what gave them the most nightmares was not the front, but the camp. Not only the piled corpses, but the memory of having shot unarmed men, of having allowed a famished multitude to destroy their executioners. It was a trauma that would accompany them for decades. On the 29th of April 1945, Dachau was transformed into the inverted mirror of the terror it had sustained for years. The mass execution of the SS guards was not an ordered act, nor planned, nor recorded in official documents as part of a military operation. It was a brutal outburst, a collective emotional rupture that swept away any border between justice and vengeance. There in that camp soaked with blood and stench, history twisted forever. Brutal executions in Buchenwald. In the final days of March and the 1st of April 1945, Buchenwald concentration camp was a boiling pot of extreme tensions. The American front advanced rapidly from the west, and the Luftwaffe no longer dominated the skies. The roar of the cannons could be heard from the nearby hills, and the prisoners, hardened by years of captivity, understood that the fall of the Third Reich was only hours away. Inside the camp, however, the machinery of terror of the SS kept working, though with less and less energy, like a wounded animal that still tries to bite before dying. The inmates had learned to read the signs of their guards. The SS officers no longer walked with their usual arrogance, but with restless eyes always looking toward the barbed wire, alert to distant noises. The prisoners knew the system was tottering, and that certainty lit a spark that soon became open fire. The clandestine international committee composed of communist, socialist, Jewish prisoners and other organized groups had been waiting for that moment for years. They had hidden improvised weapons, had drawn up insurrection plans, and now at last had the chance to execute their executioners without waiting for the arrival of the Allies. On the 11th of April, the revolt broke out. When the American troops were already only a few kilometers away, the prisoners seized the watchtowers and the barracks where light weapons were stored. The few SS who still remained in the camp tried to resist, but chaos was immediate. The inmates, so thin they looked like specters, hurled themselves with a rage accumulated for years. Some fired with rifles seized from the guards. Others used knives, stones, sticks. It was a mass that roared, that moved like a swarm hungry for justice. The captured SS were dragged to the central yard. The testimonies speak of scenes of merciless lynching. Officers who, until the day before, ordered executions with a simple nod of the head, begged for mercy, promised obedience, asked to be handed over to the Allies. No one listened. The prisoners threw themselves on them like wolves on prey. They knocked them to the ground and beat them until the bones cracked. Some were hanged from improvised ropes tied to beams or posts. Others were lined up against a wall and summarily executed. The violence did not distinguish ranks. Capos, who had collaborated with the SS, gaining privileges by denouncing and torturing their own companions, were recognized and marked for death. A shout was enough. That one stole my bread ration. That one beat my brother to death for the crowd to pounce. The bodies were shattered with blows from iron bars, the faces crushed with kicks. There was no process, music, no formal accusation. The memory of suffering was the only proof. Some accounts say that the prisoners kept several SS alive for hours, beating them intermittently, letting them crawl through the mud before giving them the final blow. It was a macabre spectacle of revenge, where torture changed hands. The executioners of yesterday became toys of the unleashed rage of those who had survived hunger. Typhus, the gas chambers of Avitz, before being transferred to Buchenwald. Each blow was a reckoning with history. When the soldiers of the 6th American Armored Division finally entered the camp, the smoke still floated over the barracks. The stench of corpses was unbearable. They saw bodies of SS scattered in the yards, some naked, others hanging from improvised ropes. The prisoners, destroyed by weakness, but inflamed by fury, showed the visitors the remains of their executioners, with a mixture of pride and madness. They had taken power for a few hours and had exercised it with the same brutality they had suffered. The shock for the Americans was immediate. They expected to find famished prisoners waiting for their liberation. But they found a camp where justice had already been served ruthlessly. American officers wrote in their diaries that they had never seen such pure, concentrated hatred. The outburst of violence was so raw that some soldiers felt unable to intervene. It was impossible to order men who had lost their entire families, who had been reduced to tattooed numbers on their skin, to leave alive those who had tortured them. The scene was repeated in different corners of the camp. In the barracks, the prisoners went through the rows, searching for hidden capos. They pulled them out from under the bunks, dragged them out, and hauled them to the yard where blows awaited them. In the basements, some guards tried to hide among mountains of corpses, covering themselves with blood-stained blankets. They were discovered and lynched on the spot. No one could escape the fierce gaze of the prisoners, Music, who remembered every face, every gesture, every voice that had dictated punishments, Music, for years. Buchenwald became a laboratory of vengeance. The iron discipline that had ruled the camp for years evaporated in hours, replaced by the chaos of wild justice. There were no leaders giving orders for lynchings, no improvised tribunals. It was the crowd itself that dictated sentences with an accusatory finger and a blow from an iron bar. The cries of the dying SS mixed with music, the victory chants of the prisoners. A deafening chorus that sealed the end of terror. Music, the brutality also reached women who had worked as auxiliaries. Several were recognized by female prisoners who had suffered their blows and humiliations. They were dragged by the hair, beaten with fury, and killed in the middle of the yard. The soldiers who arrived shortly after found them still lying in the mud, their faces unrecognizable from the beating. The outburst of Buchenwald was different from that of Dau because here the prisoners had prepared the insurrection in advance. It was not only an outburst of disorganized rage. There was a conscious will to show that they could take control. Music, to prove that they were capable of rising against their executioners. The reckoning was brutal because it was loaded with a silent preparation that had lasted months, even years. Each prisoner knew whom to look for, whom to point out, whom to destroy. Music, the camp was transformed into a scene of blood. The yards were covered with dark puddles, the walls stained with shots, the bodies of the SS piled up like remains, the air saturated with smoke, and death vibrated with the echo of screams. For the prisoners, those minutes were the only imaginable way to recover some dignity, to shout to the world that they were not only victims, music that they could make their executioners pay with the same coin. On the 11th of April, 1945, Benbald was not liberated. It was taken. And in that taking, the executioners were executed with the same brutality they had sawn for years. Mauthausen and Absey. When the Americans crossed the gates of Mauthausen on the 5th of May, 1945, they found a hell that seemed not to have changed at all since the war initially began. The camp nestled in the hills of Austria smelled of rotten flesh, quick lime, bodies undone by hunger. The quarries were strewn with bones. The barracks were tombs in life. Tens of thousands of prisoners could barely remain standing, reduced to skeletons wrapped in rags. The reception was delirium, raised arms, shouts of joy, staggering bodies that fell to their knees before the Sherman tanks. But liberation was not only an outburst of joy. It was also the hour of vengeance. In Mount, the prisoners had awaited that moment with unbearable tension. They had spent years watching their companions murdered in the quarries, thrown down the stairway of death, shot in the yard. They knew by heart the music face of each capo, of each SS who had enjoyed the suffering of others. And when the chains of Nazi discipline broke, there was no mercy. The guards who had not fled were caught and dragged by the crowd. The testimonies speak of brutal lynchings in the very central square. Men who until the day before had walked proudly with shining boots and weapons at their side were knocked down with punches, kicked on the ground, struck with stones until their skulls split open like ripe fruit. Some prisoners focused on the capos. Those privileged inmates who had gained power through denunciations and cruelty were hated with particular intensity. The liberated prisoners hunted them like animals inside the barracks. They dragged them out and executed them without further ado. Many were hanged from improvised ropes, others crushed with iron bars. The ground was stained with fresh blood, while the screams resounded among the walls of the camp. Music, there was no possible restraint. Each blow was a discharge of years of humiliation, hunger, death. In the hours after the entry of the Americans, the entire camp became an unleashed cage. The soldiers, overwhelmed by what they saw, pious of corpses, sick, dying in their own filth, children turned into walking skeletons, could hardly intervene. Many simply did not want to. They understood it was not their place to stop the fury of those who had survived hell. The result was an orgy of violence. The prisoners ran from one side to another, pointing out executioners, dragging them across the ground, beating them until they no longer moved. Justice was immediate, without words, without questions, without pauses. Iban, a subcamp of Mount, was even more brutal. Entering on the 6th of May, the Americans discovered a camp overcrowded, with over 18,000 inmates in truly indescribable living conditions. The underground galleries where the Nazis had tried to build weapons factories were full of corpses. The guards who remained there knew there was no escape. Some tried to surrender to the Americans, but the prisoners stood in the way. The famished crowd, who could barely stand, found one last reserve of strength to pounce on them. The testimonies describe bodies of SS beaten with stones, dragged through the streets of the camp, hanged from electric posts. The screams of pain were received with frenzied laughter. In Ebony, the violence was indiscriminate. It was not only about settling accounts with recognized officers, but about destroying anyone who wore a uniform or an insignia. Young recruits, kitchen auxiliaries, even clerks were killed alongside veteran SS. The crowd made no distinctions. Each prisoner saw in those uniforms the embodiment of all the suffering endured. Hatred was unleashed, like an uncontrollable tide. The blows were so repeated that some bodies were left unrecognizable, reduced to bloody masses in the mud. The accounts of witnesses speak of atrocious scenes. Guards chased into the barracks, pushed out, beaten with wooden planks until their spines were broken. Others were thrown from the top of the walls and finished off with stones. The prisoners did not shout words of justice. They shouted names of children, of wives, of murdered parents. Each blow was personal, intimate. The violence was a physical translation of a pain that could not be expressed in any other way. The chaos did not end with the arrival of the Americans. For days afterward, the prisoners continued executing capos and collaborators. The soldiers found bodies of SS in the fields, in the ditches, in the quarries. Some had been hanged with signs that said murderer or thief. Others had been mutilated before dying. The entire camp breathed an air of implacable revenge, a total inversion of the order that had reigned until then. The Spanish survivors of Mauthausen left especially vivid testimonies. Many recounted how they recognized Carpos, who had tortured their companions in the quarry, forcing them to carry impossible stones until they collapsed. Those men were the first to die. The hatred accumulated during years of slavery found its target in them. A former prisoner remembered, "It did not matter what we did, no punishment was enough. We could beat until our hands bled, and still it was not enough for everything they had done." In Ebony, the scene became almost ritual. The prisoners captured a guard, surrounded him, beat him in a circle, each one delivering a blow as if it were an offering. The body slowly fell until it was reduced to an inert mass. Then they dragged it through the mud, leaving it exposed so that everyone could see it. It was a way of affirming that the order had changed, that terror no longer belonged to the SS, but to those who had been their victims. The fury was not limited to men. Many female prisoners who had survived Ravensbrück and had been transferred to Mauthausen took part in the lynchings. They dragged by the hair the female guards who had beaten, humiliated, and killed defenseless women. They dragged them across the ground, kicked them until they were unrecognizable. Vengeance was total, without gender, without limits. The brutality of Mauthausen and Annecy showed to what extent the liberation of the camps did not mean immediate peace, but an explosion of violence. The barbed wire was opened, but what emerged was not a peaceful crowd, but a torrent of accumulated hatred that needed to be expressed in blood. The prisoners, for years reduced to shadows, became judges, music executioners, and enforcers. Each death of an SS was an act of momentary redemption, a desperate way of telling the world that they could still decide, even if only for a few hours, over life and death. The madnesses of Bergen-Belsen. On the 15th of April 1945, British troops entered Bergen-Belsen. What they found was an abyss beyond any battlefield. More than 60,000 prisoners were still alive, but they were walking skeletons covered in sores-plagued music with typhus, dysentery, and hunger. The camp had become a dump of human bodies. 13,000 corpses lay unburied in streets, in barracks, music piled up in open pits where worms moved among bare human ribs. The stench was unbearable, a pestilential cloud that covered kilometers around. Hell was there, visible in every corner. And in the midst of that scene, when the SS lost control, violence erupted. The collapse of Nazi authority in Bergen-Belsen was not ordered nor progressive. It was a sudden collapse. The guards knew the British were near. Some fled in the night, throwing away their uniforms and trying to blend with the local population. Others stayed, believing they could surrender and save their lives. The female guards of the camp, the Alferinen, still marched with whips and dogs until the last moment, convinced that their feminine condition would protect them. It was a fatal mistake. The prisoners, weak to the point of inhuman, suddenly found unexpected strength. The rumor that the British were approaching had circulated for days, and when the first armored vehicles appeared behind the barbed wire, something changed in the air. Those who could barely crawl stood up. Those who had lost all hope found a music brutal energy. They hurled themselves at their executioners with the fury accumulated over years of suffering. There were no words, no warnings. There were screams and blows. The scenes were atrocious. Several SS guards were knocked down in the yards, stripped of their weapons, and lynched right there. The prisoners surrounded them en masse, unloading stones, sticks, any object that could serve as a weapon. Physical weakness was transformed into unleashed rage, fragile bones striking until breaking other bones, bony hands clutching throats, and squeezing until suffocation. The air was filled with screams of pain, with curses shouted in Polish, Russian, French, Hebrew, German. It was a chorus of vengeance. The female guards fared no better. No. In Bergen-Belsen, there were dozens of SS women who had made sadism a routine. The testimonies say they dragged female prisoners by the hair, beat them until disfigured, mocked the dying. When control collapsed, the liberated prisoners identified them immediately. They dragged them through the mud, tore their clothes, beat them with stones, until their faces were unrecognizable. Some were hanged from improvised ropes. Others were finished off with kicks, their screams silenced by collective fury. The body of one officerin was found days later, naked and mutilated, abandoned in a corner of the camp like refuse. The British, upon entering, could not prevent the outbreak. They were too stunned by what they saw. Piles of rotten corpses, children dying in puddles of excrement, men who could barely hold their heads. The vision was so unbearable that many soldiers stepped aside to vomit. In that climate, the idea of protecting the SS was unthinkable. They saw the lynchings and did not intervene. Some even tolerated them as inevitable. Chaos reigned and military discipline dissolved in the face of the magnitude of the horror. The prisoners did not limit themselves to killing. They also humiliated. Some guards were forced to carry corpses to drag the bodies of the dead to the mass graves before being music executed. It was a symbolic act, forcing them to confront even for minutes the result of their crimes. They were forced to walk over the corpses to contemplate the glassy eyes of those they had exterminated before being beaten to death. Hatred was not satisfied with death. It needed degradation. It needed to return even a fraction of the torment suffered. During the first days after liberation, violence continued. The British tried to organize mass burials to contain the typhus epidemic, but the prisoners, whenever they recognized a Karpo or a disguised guard, hurled themselves at him. Several were killed in front of the pits where corpses were thrown. Some were buried alive among the heaps of bodies. The mud of Bergen-Belsen became a swamp of blood and death that did not distinguish between the living and the dead. The testimonies speak of scenes of uncontrolled brutality. A group of prisoners recognized an SS who had whipped to death dozens of companions. They dragged him to a pile of corpses and forced him to lie among them. They beat him until he stopped moving and then threw his body along with the others. Another account tells how a prisoner found the female guard who had killed her sister and stabbed her repeatedly with a rusty knife, shouting the dead woman's name at each thrust. The entire camp became a space where the frontier between justice and vengeance disintegrated. There were no trials, no records, no intention to document anything. It was the purest, most direct violence. The survivors reduced to shadows, transformed into executioners for a few hours. Each death was a cry of stolen dignity, a desperate act of redemption. Bergen-Belsen showed clearly to what extent liberation was not a clean process, but an emotional cataclysm. Music. The prisoners who had seen their families die, who had been reduced to numbers, who had survived by eating grass or rats, could music no longer contain themselves? When they saw their executioners fall, they did not seek mercy. They sought destruction, and they found it in a frenzy that left the streets of the camp sown with corpses of SS alongside those of the victims. For the British, Bergen-Belsen was a trauma that would mark them for life. Many wrote that the worst thing was not the corpses, but the fury of the liberated prisoners. The vision of men and women turned into skeletons beating with inhuman rage, their jailers was a reminder of how deep hatred could go. It was a hell where there were no innocents, where liberation was stained with fresh blood. The border between justice and vengeance. The morning the gates of the camps were opened, the air filled with a fury that knew no music limits. The image of piled corpses, of barracks turned into living tombs, of children reduced to music skeletons who still breathed unleashed a rage that had been accumulating for years. In that instant, justice ceased to be an abstract word and became an immediate act, visceral, executed with bare hands or with the butt of a rifle. But the inevitable question arose from each blow, from each shot against a guard. Was it justice or was it vengeance? For the prisoners, the distinction did not exist. For years they had seen how a gesture from an SS decided life or death. A nod of the head sent a man to the quarry, another to the gas chamber, another to the barrack of the sick, where no one came out alive. The executioners asked for no evidence and offered no trials. They pronounced sentences with the naturalness of someone choosing a plate of food. At the moment of liberation, the prisoners applied the same inverted logic. There was no evidence. There were no defenses. The memory of a face, the recollection of a blow, the name of a dead comrade was enough for someone to be condemned to die on the spot. In Dao, the train cars filled with corpses were the most forceful sentence. The American soldiers found them open with bodies swollen from decomposition, empty eyes that seemed to look in accusation. When the prisoners pointed at an SS and shouted, "That one did this to us," there were no doubts. The soldiers pushed the accused aside and shot him against a wall. Was it justice? Was it vengeance? For the prisoners, it was the same. The balance was leveled in blood. In Buchenwald, the internal revolt marked clearly that diffuse border. The organized prisoners did not wait for the Allies. They executed their executioners in the yards, hanging them from improvised ropes. The capos, who had enjoyed privileges at the cost of the misery of their companions, were lynched without mercy. The screams of the accused asked for trial, asked for mercy. There was none. Music of that. Justice, understood in legal terms, never appeared. What there was pure vengeance, the immediate repayment of years of pain. But for those who had suffered, that vengeance was justice. They needed no other form. In Mauthausen and ENC, the famished music prisoners, unable to remain standing, found strength to beat the SS until destroying them. They did not seek proceedings or records. They sought the brutal satisfaction of seeing the executioners dragged through the mud. Each stone thrown, each kick delivered on a fallen body was an act of reparation. It was impossible to separate one concept from the other. The justice denied to them for years was manifested as vengeance. In Bergen-Belsen, the female prisoners who identified the Alfieren and who had tortured them did not hesitate. They dragged them, beat them, killed them while shouting. No one spoke of legal justice. No one thought of tribunals. The border was erased in the middle of the mud, covered with corpses. Justice in that moment was seeing the female executioners beaten music to death, feeling that power had changed hands. Vengeance was the only form of justice that could be understood by those who had seen all of their own die. The Allied soldiers found themselves trapped in that gray area. Some tried to stop the lynchings to order that the SSS be made prisoners to be judged, but most had no strength to intervene. They had seen the piled bodies. They had breathed the stench of concentrated death. They themselves felt the need to shoot, to unload their weapons on those who surrendered with hands raised. It was an impulse that erased any distinction. Military discipline collapsed before the horror. The justice their flags proclaimed was transformed into summary executions, into immediate vengeance. The border was so tenuous that even later testimonies confused it. Some prisoners remembered with pride having lynched their captives. Others recounted it with shame, as if they had participated in something unconfessable. To music, for some it was necessary justice, for others unleashed vengeance. Memory could not resolve the contradiction. The books, the later trials, the memorials all faced the same dilemma. How to name that violence? How to classify the blows of a famished man against the face of an SS as justice or as vengeance? The truth is that in the moment there was no reflection. The violence was immediate, inevitable. It could not be contained. Music. The prisoners did not deliberate. They acted. The border did not exist because there was no time to draw it. In each lynching, in each improvised shooting, the desire for punishment and the hunger for revenge were mixed. Justice with a capital letter became a useless concept. Vengeance, with all its brutality, was the only possible law. In the mud of Dachau, in the improvised ropes of Buchenwald, in the quarries of Mauthausen, In the hell of Bergen-Belsen, the line was erased forever. There were no prosecutors or lawyers. There were bony hands squeezing throats. There were rifle butts striking against skulls. There were bodies of SS hanging like trophies. Justice and vengeance merged into a single word: death. And that word was written again and again in fresh blood on the blackened walls of the camps. The reaction of the Allies. When the Allies opened the gates of the camps, they not only liberated tens of thousands of prisoners, they also became trapped in a whirlwind of violence that they could not or would not stop. The vision was unbearable. The wagons of Dachau with hundreds of bodies piled like firewood. The yards of Bonwald strewn with abandoned corpses. The trenches of Mauthausen turned into open pits. The pestilential swamp of Bergen-Belsen, where the dead and the living shared the same mud. The soldiers, hardened by years of combat, broke down when they saw that. And in that breakdown, the immediate reaction was silence, fury, indifference, or complicity in the executions of the SS. In Dachau, the arrival of the 45th Infantry Division became the prelude to a massacre. The men in khaki uniforms had fought in Anzio in the Gothic line in the Ardennes. They had seen comrades die in snow-filled trenches, had smelled gunpowder in every German city reduced to ruins, but nothing prepared them for the death wagons. They opened them, and the stench struck them like a punch to the stomach. Swollen bodies, torsos burst from decomposition, faces reduced to skulls. Many vomited right there. Others cried like children. Others loaded their weapons and fired at the first SS they found. There were no orders. There was pure rage unleashed. The prisoners pointed to their executioners, and the soldiers did not hesitate. Music. They pulled the accused aside, lined them against a wall, and shot them on the spot. Some did not even bother to ask names. The black insignia on the collar or the gray-green uniform was enough for the Americans. In that instant, there were no laws of war. There was only one reflex: to kill the men who had created that hell. The yard of Dachau filled with bodies of executed music, SS mixed with the cries of jubilation of the liberated prisoners in Buchenwald. The Americans arrived late. The internal insurrection had already executed many guards. They saw the prisoners hanging the SS from improvised ropes, heard the shots from rifles taken from the executioners, smelled the fresh blood. Some officers tried to restore order to demand discipline, but most limited themselves to watching. The horror of the barracks with hundreds of unburied corpses, music, prevented any gesture of restraint. How could one ask for calm from men who had survived years of torture? How could one protect the executioners' music in the middle of that mire of death? The reaction was silence, music, passivity, even complicity. In Bergen-Belsen, the British lived the hardest nightmare. They entered with masks and cloths, covering their noses because the stench of corpses, music, and dysentery was unbearable. They saw skeletal women dragging their former guards through the mud, beating them with stones until unrecognizable. The officers knew that those women were criminals, that they had whipped prisoners to death. They did not lift a finger to save them. Some even turned their gaze away, pretending not to see. The priority was to bury the thousands of corpses to contain the typhus epidemic. That some guards were lynched in the middle of the chaos was for them a minor problem, almost logical. In Ebony, the Americans witnessed the pure fury of men reduced to ghosts. They could barely walk, but they launched themselves at the guards with animal force. They beat them with stones, with wood, with bare hands. The soldiers limited themselves to watching. Some even handed over butts, bayonets, unloaded weapons, as if they knew that violence was inevitable. For the liberators, preventing it would have been to betray what they felt in their guts. Many had lost friends in combat, and now they saw the bodies of thousands of murdered civilians. Letting the prisoners take revenge was an act of immediate justice that could not go through a tribunal. The Allied reaction also had a dark side. There were soldiers who actively participated in the executions. In Dachau, testimonies speak of a platoon lining up dozens of SS and shooting them in mass while famished prisoners applauded. In other camps, officers ordered improvised executions of capos and guards. The line between liberating and settling scores blurred in the mud of the barbed wire. Military discipline broke down, and what remained was the fury of men who had seen too much. There was no lack of voices that were scandalized. Some senior officers condemned the executions and demanded reports. There were attempts to censor the stories, to erase the images of summarily executed guards. But the rumor circulated among the troops in Diau, in Buchenwald, in Mount the Allies had allowed and sometimes encouraged the massacre of the SS. The soldiers who returned to their units did not speak of medals or victories. They spoke of bodies of guards with shattered skulls in the yards, of SS women dragged until unrecognizable, of men who had begged for mercy and did not receive it. The reaction was not uniform. There were also officers who tried to save some prisoners from themselves, who formed cordons to prevent lynchings, who arrested the SS to hand them over to military justice. But those scenes were exceptional, almost anecdotal. In most of the camps, the reality was different. The soldiers were too shocked, too disgusted, too furious to contain the wave of vengeance. The emotional shock that the Allies experienced in the camps did not remain there. Many carried nightmares for the rest of their lives. They wrote letters in which they, music, confessed to having shot unarmed men, to having witnessed lynchings without intervening, to having felt satisfaction at seeing the SS die. The frontier between the justice of the victor and the vengeance of the victims blurred in the conscience of those who were present. There was no manual that could prepare a man for Dachau or Bergen-Belsen. The reaction of the Allies then was human in its brutality. They were not judges. They were not mediators. They were witnesses dragged by the same whirlwind that shook the prisoners. Some fired, others let it happen, others stepped aside in silence. All understood that, in that place, the word justice had no meaning. The only thing left was fury, and they were not going to stop it. Vengeance after 1945. For many survivors, the settling of accounts did not end in the mud of the barbed wire. It was only beginning. The war might have ended on paper, but the memory of the ovens and the gas chambers did not fade. The Allies spoke of tribunals, of laws of Nuremberg, for those who had seen their families die. That sounded like mockery. The liberated prisoners did not trust in a distant, bureaucratic trial full of lawyers and deadlines. They wanted blood, and they wanted it immediately. Thus was born an organized vengeance, silent and ruthless. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, groups of survivors began to meet in destroyed houses, in ruined synagogues, in abandoned taverns. They recognized each other by the numbers tattooed on their arms, by the lost gaze of those who had come out of hell. There they swore to avenge those who had not returned. Hatred turned into discipline. What had been uncontrolled rage in the camps was transformed into plans, into lists, into names that circulated by word of mouth. Former camp guards, local collaborators, informers, auxiliary police, all were targets. In the streets of Eastern Europe, bodies appeared hanging from trees with signs nailed to their chests that said murderer or executioner. In some towns, the houses of former members of the Gestapo were set on fire with them inside. The black smoke covered the roofs, and the neighbors looked on in silence, not daring to intervene. It was a settling of accounts tolerated, even secretly celebrated. In the chaos of the post-war, when armies withdrew music and new authorities were not yet established, the terrain was fertile for that vengeance. In cities like Łódź, Krakow, or Bratislava, the survivors moved in groups, identified a collaborator, and dragged him to a square. They beat him in front of everyone, humiliated him, executed him without trial. No one asked anything. No music, one reported anything. The police were overwhelmed, the governments were fragile, and the whole world was too busy with the remnants of war to stop a few men who sought justice with their hands. But it was not only disorganized fury. There were those who turned that need into a systematic plan. Among them, the group known as Nakam, vengeance in Hebrew, led by Abba Kovna, a survivor of VNA. Its members were young, mostly war orphans, hardened by years of fighting in the resistance. They dreamed of vengeance on a biblical scale, to poison the water systems of German cities to kill 6 million Germans as the exact response to the 6 million Jews murdered. They did not seek to punish individual culprits. They wanted to exterminate an entire people, to return genocide with genocide. Yukai from why? Although the most ambitious plan never materialized, Nikam carried out actions that marked the line between justice and vengeance. In Nuremberg, members of the group infiltrated bakeries that supplied German prisoners of war. They poisoned loaves with arsenic and distributed them en masse. Hundreds of former members of the SS fell ill. Dozens died slowly, vomiting and convulsing in the prisoner barracks. Allied reports tried to minimize the event to hide it under the rug of silence, but rumors spread. It was proof that the survivors were not content to see their executioners in a tribunal. They wanted to see them writhe in pain. In the displaced persons camps, where tens of thousands of survivors awaited an uncertain fate, networks of vengeance were also woven. Some recognized among the refugees capos or collaborators who had escaped, disguised as victims. Right there, among wooden barracks, they hunted them. Sometimes they killed them in silence. Sometimes they organized improvised trials, a table, an accused, a few witnesses, a quick sentence. Most of the time, the sentence was death, executed by beatings, sometimes with a shot to the nape. The corpses disappeared in common graves without records, without names. The Soviets occupying much of Eastern Europe looked with indifference on those acts. For them, the defeated enemy deserved the scorn, and the survivors who executed an SS were not a problem. In some cases, they even closed their eyes, allowing entire groups of former Nazis to disappear in the middle of the night. The post-war was a world of shadows where law was diffuse and hatred had free rein. In Germany itself, there were survivors who organized hunts. They infiltrated villages, tracked down former guards who had returned to civilian life, followed them to their homes, and executed them right there in front of their families. Some left messages written in blood on the walls. Others disappeared without a trace, kidnapped by groups who tortured them before killing them. The neighbors knew it, but no one spoke. Silence was a form of complicity, a tacit recognition that those men had deserved their fate. The organized vengeance after 1945 was not limited to killing. There were also public humiliations. Music, former guards, forced to parade naked through the streets, with signs hanging from their necks, identifying them as murderers. Collaborators had their heads shaved and were marked with ink on their foreheads. Former SS forced to dig graves for corpses before being thrown into them. Each act was an inverted mirror of the regime that had fallen. The executioners turned into victims, the powerful into wrecks. The border between vengeance and justice was completely erased. In those months, the Allies tried to build tribunals to gather evidence to establish a legal narrative. But in the streets, in the displaced persons' camps, in the forests, another faster justice imposed itself. A justice that needed no witnesses or records. Music, the tattoo on the arm of the accuser and the uniform, or the memory in the mind were enough. The sentence was pronounced in seconds, music, and the execution in minutes. The brutality of those acts was transmitted by word of mouth in whispers among survivors. Some told it with pride, others hid it with shame. But all knew it. Vengeance had been real. It had been organized. It had been inevitable. In the post-war, there was no space for reconciliations. There was a continent in ruins, millions of dead cities reduced to rubble. In the midst of that landscape, the blood of a few hundred executioners fallen in reprisals was nothing. And yet, for those who had survived, it was everything. The liberation of the camps was not a clean or luminous dawn. It was an eruption of chaos where humanity showed its most naked face, marked by accumulated hatred and suffering. The Allied soldiers entered expecting to be received as liberators and found an abyss. Mountains of corpses. Music. Thousands of famished who could barely breathe. The plague of typhus floating in the air. The collapse of the Nazi regime had left an open wound. And in that wound, violence was unleashed. The prisoners, music who for years had been stripped of everything, even of their identity, did not wait for trials or tribunals. They pointed with their fingers at the capos, at the SS, at the female guards who had exercised absolute power over life and death, and they executed them. Right there with stones, with sticks, with bare hands. The Allies, unable to endure what they saw, let it happen. Some even participated. It was impossible to demand calm in the midst of that hell. The rules of war had become useless before the magnitude of the crime. With the passing of months, the fury did not subside. It organized itself into clandestine networks, into groups that sought vengeance beyond the torn-down walls. From lynchings in villages to plans of mass extermination, like that dreamed by the Nakam group, the violence continued as an implacable echo of what had been lived in the camps. The memory of those days was marked by an uncomfortable silence. Because in the liberation there was joy. Yes, but there was also blood. And in that blood was written the other face of victory. The certainty that after so much pain, justice could not be separated from vengeance. And that liberation was also an orgy of